This is Talking Foreign Policy and Internationalist Perspective on Canada's Role Abroad, and I'm Yves Engler. On Friday, South Africa asked the International Court of Justice for an emergency request to declare Israel in breach of its obligations under the 1948 Genocide Convention. Israel is a signatory to the convention, and has already announced it will respond, which is reportedly the first time they've ever collaborated with international legal challenge tribunal. Today, lawyer Dimitri Lascaris is with us to discuss South Africa's effort to restrict Israeli crimes against Palestinians and Canada's reaction. Thanks a lot for coming on, Dimitri.
Always a pleasure, Yves. Good to talk to you.
So my first question is just, can you give us a brief overview of South Africa's request to the International Court of Justice and the sort of political ramifications of this request?
South Africa is relying upon a provision of the Statute of the International Court of Justice, which is the highest court in the United Nations system. It's sometimes referred to as the World Court. And it's also relying upon a provision of the Genocide Convention to which both Israel and South Africa and the United States and Canada are parties, to assert a claim of genocide against Israel, and to request from the International Court of Justice, I'm going to refer to it as the ICJ, provisional relief, injunctive relief, which is basically an order for Israel to stop committing genocidal acts against the Palestinian people. I'm not going to get into the precise wording of these two provisions, the one in the statute of the ICJ and the other one in the Genocide Convention. But from my perspective, there's really no serious question that the ICJ has the jurisdiction to adjudicate this claim. And the only real question is whether it will grant the relief that South Africa is requesting. And even there shouldn't be, if you're looking at the evidence objectively and the law objectively, any real question about whether the relief should be granted. It's a slam dunk that the relief should be granted. And I think it will be granted. And I'll mention, what I think the political ramifications of that are in a second. But my one concern, of course, is that the United States government is undoubtedly, and its vassal states in the West will do everything possible they can to intimidate, coerce, and pervert the course of justice in this case. I am reassured by the fact that this same court, the International Court of Justice in 2004, unanimously rendered a decision that Israel's settlements in the West Bank were a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Now, a fair bit of time has passed since then. The United States, may or may not have more of an ability to pervert the course of justice now than it did in 2004. But I still believe fairly strongly that the court will do the right thing and grant the relief. If it does grant the relief being requested, it is, of course, possible that Israel will thumb its nose at the decision of the International Court of Justice. But let's recall that genocide is the worst crime in international, both morally and legally. It is by far the worst crime that a state or non-state actor can commit. And if the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the United Nations system, renders a judgment, even on a provisional basis, that Israel is committing genocide, this will have, I believe, massive political ramifications. All the governments of the West that have done everything they can in the court of public opinion, which isn't really a court. Okay, let's be honest. When you're talking to media personalities in the West who are employed by these for-profit corporations that have their own little political agenda, you're not really subjected to meaningful scrutiny if you are a Western government official or you're from, an ally or proxy of the West. That's not really a court. You get into, the International Court of Justice, you're dealing with a whole different set of rules. You actually have to produce evidence that's credible to support your position. You have to support your position not by reference to people's innate bigotry or their presumptions, their biases, but actually by reference to the jurisprudence to international treaties, which have been, elaborated, analyzed over decades by experts in international law. It's a totally different ballgame. And if you get a judgment emerging from that context, a real court of law, saying that Israel is committing the worst crime that any human being, any state actor can commit, it is going to be extremely difficult for people in the halls of power in the West to ignore that judgment.
And in South Africa's submission, I haven't read it all. I've just read some reviews of it. I haven't even looked at it, but I've read a couple of multiple articles reviewing it. It seems very detailed case, and I've just read that at the level of the actual intent to genocide. And I know that oftentimes it's hard to prove the intent in lots of different cases that are widely considered genocides. Like, for instance, in Rwanda, I know that what the claim of the intent is pretty minimal. The actual number of people killed is pretty clear cut, but the intent question is hard to document. But in this case, we have Israeli officials from the prime minister on down, ministers, whatever, all stating pretty clearly that their intent to commit genocide. And I know that the report sort of details example after example from all the different ministers, a little bit about sort of what's in the kind of the report on that front, and all just the horrors of what Israel's actually done, which we sort of all know a little bit, but brings it together kind of dynamic.
Yeah, so I commend to anybody. It's a very simple provision to read. Article 2 of the Genocide Convention of 1948. And, again, this is a legal instrument, and the determination of whether Israel is committing genocide is a legal question. This cannot be stressed enough. This is not a political opinion, although it has political ramifications. Whether it's committing genocide is a legal question, and it is resolved by reference to the applicable law and the available and admissible evidence. So what does the Genocide Convention say in Article 2? It basically says, if you commit certain acts of an inhumane nature, and it lists 5 examples, okay, with the intent to destroy in whole or in part, I stress, or in part, a racial, ethnic, or national group, you are guilty of genocide. So those 5 acts, Israel's committed all of them. So, for example, killing, large numbers of the target population. Clearly, it's done that. Depriving them of the conditions necessary for life. Israel has openly declared that it is, depriving the people of Palestine, one half of Gaza, one half of whom are children, of food, fuel, water, and electricity. I mean, it's a slam dunk that they're doing that one. The only one, actually, of these 5 illustrative examples of heinous acts that Israel I had a question in my mind about whether Israel was committing them, was transferring children of the target population to another population. But even that, in the last few days, reports have emerged that Israeli soldiers are taking children, Palestinian children, out of Gaza and transferring them to unknown destinations, probably within Israel. So that one too, it's committing all of the acts that are enumerated, and it's not an exhaustive list. You only have to, by the way, commit one of those acts, not all 5 of them, okay, to be guilty of genocide. Then the only question remains, that's a slam dunk. Does Israel have the requisite intent? And I believe, Yves, what we've witnessed over the past 3 months is the consequence of 75 years of complete and utter impunity. As I've said many times, impunity makes people stupid. They become careless. They become reckless. They become hubristic. And this is exactly what's happened to Israel's leaders, so that they're not even hiding what their intentions are anymore. It's not just the prime minister. Isaac Herzog, the supposed moderate, the president of the state of Israel, said at the very outset that effectively there are no innocents in Gaza. They're all responsible, all of them. He didn't even exclude children from his damnation, because they could have risen up against Hamas and they didn't rise up against Hamas, he said.
The 2-year-olds.
Yes, exactly. The children of Gaza, the babies, the toddlers, should have risen up against Hamas, and because they didn't do that, they're guilty. This is the psychopath who's the president of Israel. The prime minister said, we're going to turn Gaza into a deserted island. He invoked the biblical extract, which related to a figure called Amalek. And he likened the Palestinian people to Amalek. And in the Old Testament, the Israelites were directed to kill everything associated with Amalek, the children, the women, the cattle, the sheep, everything. Wipe them out entirely. You have the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, comparing the Palestinians to human animals and saying, we are going to deprive them of all the necessities of life. You have, Smotrich just coming out, the minister of finance, and saying, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if there were only 100 or 200,000 Arabs left in Gaza and we repopulated it with Israeli settlers? So more than 90% of the population being removed. And by the way, the 2.3 million people in Gaza constitute somewhere in the range of, I think, 35 to 45% of the total population of Palestinians within historic Palestine. So we're talking about a very material part of the population. There's absolutely no question. It's a slam dunk that Israel has the intent. It's at the highest levels of the government and the military. There is the intent to destroy, at least in part, if not in whole, the Palestinian people, who are clearly a racial, ethnic, and national group. So this is a slam dunk case of genocide. The International Court of Justice, if it's acting in accordance with principle and not in accordance with politics, should have no difficulty whatsoever in granting the relief being sought by South Africa.
And so moving on to the Canadian angle to this, to the best of my knowledge, the only media, corporate media, that's really covered this from a Canadian angle, I think CBC posted a story in the AP Associated Press story about the case. But the Globe has now published two stories from a Canadian angle on this. The first one was titled "South Africa's Legal Effort to Declare Israel's Actions, quote, genocidal in character, poses dilemma for Canada." The story discusses a number of recent International Court of Justice submissions that Canada's been part of, including related to genocide, that Canada's intervened on. And so I guess the question is that what do you expect Canada's response to be in this case? And then I should also say there's been already a follow-up Globe piece where Global Affairs has refusing to actually respond to Jeffrey York, the Globe Mail correspondent in South Africa, who's published these two stories. So yes, what do you sort of expect Canada's response to be in all this?
Well, I'm going to quote from the more recent of these Globe reports because I couldn't agree more with this sentiment. There was in the Globe report, which I believe you sent to me, was issued today. A professor of international law by the name of Kirsten said quite appropriately that what the Canadian government does in these situations when it comes to Israel is it doesn't actually look at the law. It doesn't look at the evidence. What it does is it makes a determination based purely upon crass, cynical politics that it's going to defend Israel's position no matter what it does. And then after the fact, it tries to come up with some legal pretext, however flimsy, however unprincipled, however outrageous it may be, to justify the political stance that it's taken. And he expresses the view that that is what Canada is likely to do in this case. I see absolutely no reason to doubt that. I mean, let's just look at, I could give you so many examples, Yves. I know I don't have to tell you, but the readers our listeners may be interested in knowing of a very recent example of Canada's complete and utter moral bankruptcy when it comes to Israel. They said that they supported, the creation of a two-state solution. Justin Trudeau has been saying this until he's blue in the face. He continued to say it after the genocide began in October in occupied Palestine. And then they voted against a resolution calling upon Israel to withdraw to the 1967 borders. How are the Palestinians ever going to have a state if Israel doesn't withdraw its forces to the 1967 borders? Even if it did that, and it ceded to the Palestinian people every inch of land on the Palestinian side of the 1967 borders, the Palestinian people would still have a relatively small proportion of historic Palestine. That would be an excellent, outstanding deal for the Israeli Jewish population, that, the Palestinians should content themselves with only the land that lies on the other side of the Green Line. And Canada could not even vote in favor of that at the United Nations. So this government, there's absolutely no reason to believe that they're going to do the right thing here. I believe, as Kirsten said, Professor Kirsten, that they've already made up their minds. They're going to oppose South Africa's application. And it's just a question of coming up with the least ridiculous explanation for their decision.
And I should note that only 4 or 5 months ago, when the General Assembly had called on the International Court of Justice to do a ruling on the state's responsibility to vis-a-vis the West Bank settlements, their legal responsibilities, that Canada actually sent a letter calling on the ICJ to not offer a legal opinion on the matter. That was after the General Assembly had actually called on the court to do so. And a couple of years ago, they also sent a letter to the International Criminal Court saying that the ICC should not investigate Israel's war crimes, and even sort of raised Canada's funding of the ICC as possibly being impacted if the ICC would look at the matter. So now I guess the question I have is kind of like, what do we do with this? I think this is quite a big deal. There is an action alert that the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, Just Peace Advocates, has put out, calling on the NDP to support South Africa's effort. And the idea here is in part to try to restrict the Trudeau government from pressing too hard against South Africa, because we don't expect them to actually come out. But what they should do, of course, is to join in and support South Africa's effort, but we don't expect that. But we can hope that they either stay silent, is probably the best we can hope for, or maybe they're not too aggressive in their opposition. So, what do you sort of expect of the opposition? And I know people have been sending this action alert to the Green Party as well. What do you sort of expect of the opposition, or how do you see this play out from a campaigning social movement side within Canada?
I have no doubt that the Liberals and the Conservatives will either expressly oppose what South Africa's seeking to do, or will remain mum about the matter and try to quietly file some opposition to South Africa's actions in the ICJ. I'm not so sure what the NDP and the Greens are going to do. I think they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because they know full well, Yves, that anybody in Canadian politics who accuses Israel of genocide, no matter how compelling the evidence may be, is going to be subjected to a ruthless reputational destruction campaign by the Israel lobby and all the supporters of Israel, of whom there are many in Canada's parliament. They know that that is going to invite the full wrath of supporters of Israel in this country. And frankly, we have little reason to believe that anybody in Canadian politics, certainly at the leadership level, whether it's the Greens, the NDP, the Bloc, have the moral fortitude to take on the lobby in a situation like this, to confront the full wrath of the lobby. But at the same time, we're dealing with an extraordinarily incriminating body of evidence here. What Israel is doing is so outrageous, so obviously genocidal. And now they have to deal with the possibility that the International Court of Justice will actually render a decision of genocide against Israel. And how will that make them look, especially to their base of supporters, if they refuse to support South Africa? And let's point out the obvious here. On the international stage, when it comes to demanding accountability against a racist government, there is no country on earth that has more moral authority than the South African government. These people, when it comes to the battle against racism, these are heavyweights. They are as formidable as an opponent as Israel could possibly imagine in the court of justice and the court of public opinion. So I think the leaders of the Green Party and the NDP and to a lesser extent, the Bloc Québécois are in a real quandary right now. I don't know which way they're going to come out, but if these people had any decency about them and frankly, some political good sense, and they understand what's coming, what's likely coming, they would get ahead of this and they would declare the support for South Africa.
I agree with that. On that note, we'll leave it there. This was Talking Foreign Policy and Internationalist Perspective on Canada's Role Abroad. Thanks a lot for participating, Dimitri.
Thank you, Yves. Always a pleasure.